I'll talk about another market with immense potential. We got that through the last question, but we know it anyway. Unlocking Africa and its potential is the next panel. We know it's the world's least industrialized region, and it's imperative that industry is developed there, particularly in the manufacturing space, national investment, output and trade. But rather than replicate and copy what's gone before, obviously there's a great opportunity to chart a new destination with a cleaner and resource efficient pathway to boosting that manufacturing output, rather than, as I said, the older models and impacting environmental degradation. So I have some wonderful experts for our final panel of the day to discuss this theme, and of course hopefully ask a few questions at the end. But if I could invite my panel up to the stage. Lamine Abdel-Malek, he's a senior advisor to the chairman of Roland Berger, Nobel Prize winning laureate for 2005, 20 years experience working in the UK and of course the United Nations and many other institutes as well. I've got you, Lamine, sitting here. And Dr. Mustafa Muharrem, chairman of Muharrem and Partners, Public Affairs and Strategic Communication in Egypt, worked for the World Bank and UNDIP, advising globally companies such as Amazon and Google. Welcome to the stage. Thomas Pays, CEO of Ozo from South Africa, a fintech company revolutionizing, that's a very long word late in the afternoon, digital payments across Africa, and Omo Salewa the EVP of Global Expansion and Payment Partnership at Flutterwave. Moderating this session will be Joshan Raguba, the chairperson of Ikineo Ventures, UVU Africa, and the Invis Group in South Africa as well. So please take a seat, technology and impact venture entrepreneurs. Looking forward to this one, and enjoy your panel.
Sure, finally it's time for Africa, after a full day. So we're just going to, hopefully apply some energy and insights and have a great discussion as we head into the home stretch today. But an amazing panel talking about something that is super important to me and I think to the world, but how to unlock Africa's potential. We've got amazing policy advisors and experts, investors and operators on the panel today. Possibly, environmental degradation, climate change, bad use of land and water resources, and the African youth bulge may be the two biggest challenges facing us all over the next few years. We understand the climate challenge. However, you know that over the next 10 years, by 2035, there'll be more young Africans entering the workforce than the rest of the world combined. Now, this could either be an opportunity, not just for Africa and for the world, but it could be a curse. This huge talent pool, youth bulge, will not only be the workforce for the world, it will also be the market for the rest of the world. However, there is a challenge of how to make sure that the economy is growing, in a way that's carbon positive, and we are allowing young people to participate in the growth of this economy. Trying to get these factors to interact is the challenge at hand, and that's what we're discussing today. So I'm going to start off with Lamine here to first introduce yourself and give you a background, and then answer the question and probably just give us your thoughts on how do policymakers in across the African region start to bring this trifecta of economic growth, carbon positive economic growth, and allowing young people to participate in the fruits of this economic growth.
First of all, thanks a lot for the organizers of this event. It's the second time I've attended this event, and I'm really pleased to be here. My name is Lamine Abdel-Malek. I'm a senior advisor for Roland Berger. My past history has been 15 years working for the United Nations, and I started my career off working with the British government in international development. I've always been working in Africa desk, so I'm Africa at heart. I'm actually half English, half Nigerian. And going to your question, Joshua, one of the things that I always think about is, people think about Africa as some kind of separate entity, but Africa is actually made up of individuals. And if you look at, if you want to understand Africa, you have to think about what actually makes individuals want to do something. So I was thinking a lot about this over the last, few months. I thought about breaking it down to a very simple message, what I call the 3 I's. So incentivize, innovate, and implement. When I talk about incentives, I'm thinking about, what motivates a human being to do something? And I'm thinking about bringing that down, whether it's to a country level or continent level. So the idea is that governments definitely have to take the front seat. So what I mean by incentives is like thinking about the economy, thinking about things like making it easy for people to actually want to do something. Like, if you want to get up in the morning, what motivates you to get out of bed in the morning? Is that something that you're going to, that's going to motivate you to reach your potential? So just a few examples. So in Sensitize, I thought about things like, innovation, what we call trendsetters. So looking at, making it easy for people to invest. So looking at financial regulatory control, for example, making it easy to attract talent pool. We talked a lot about talent pool over the course of the day. And when we go into innovate, we're looking at things that, once you relax as a human being, people trust you, so basically the incentives have been taken care of. It frees your mind to think about innovative problems. I mean, in Africa, there's tons of problems. We're looking at health problems, we're looking at energy problems, and I'll focus a little bit more on the energy, the green energy in a little bit. Then I think the last part was looking at implement. So what we have a lot is that, there's a lot of really good policies in Africa, but no one is really taking the initiative to implement these different programs. We're in Dubai today. So, 20 years ago, or even 30 years ago, Dubai did not really exist as it does today. But it's because of the leadership of the ruler of Dubai and his vision, and in fact, which was built on what they call the 3 T's, which was tourism, transport, and trade. That was basically what Dubai was built on. So definitely, I think in Africa, governments definitely have to take the leading role. There is no question about that. Even in people, when people come to this part of the world, they say, what we've seen is that the private sector is not running. But you're right, I say, because in this part of the world, the public sector is running, and the private sector is actually trying to catch up. And I think that's a model for Africa to start thinking about implementing as well. Now, holding down onto environmental degradation. So last year, I actually did a paper on how Morocco can become a green energy powerhouse. And that was because the International Energy Agency said there's 5 countries in the world that can lead in terms of green energy. There were Chile, USA, Saudi Arabia, Australia, and of course, Morocco. And I think, at university, I actually studied the oil sector. And I think one of the things that Africa tends to do is that they get a great asset, and they think about how to monetize that, but not for themselves. So when I did this paper, I did actually 3 steps. The first step is basically, think about your economy, think about what's going to benefit, what are the main players, and of course, education is very important. The second thing is that whatever you're going to catch on to, whether it's green energy, make it work for your people first and foremost. Don't think about how you're going to get extra foreign currency just by selling it out. Once you have a comparative advantage in your country or on the continent, then think about exporting, because it doesn't make any sense, I'm an economist by training, to export something where you don't have a comparative advantage in. All you're going to do is just make the supplier rich. So in terms of time on the panel, I'll stop there for now and hand it over to my other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much. No, that's super interesting. Mustafa, you advise corporate leaders and governments throughout the continent. And what are some of the innovative approaches from a policy perspective or implementation perspective and incentivization perspective that some of your clients are taking in trying to get this trifecta right of economic growth, carbon positive growth, and economic participation?
Thank you so much, Josh. And first, it's a great pleasure to be here today, and I'm honored to be with such a distinguished panel. I'm actually chairing right now quite a unique company. So it's one of the first public policy and strategic communications firms working in the wider Middle East and Africa region. I started my career at the Egyptian government, then I joined international organizations like the World Bank and the UNDP. I was working across with different regional governments in Africa and the Middle East, and I quickly realized something important, that actually big companies and big organizations, global organizations, have quite a problem in connecting with local governments in the region, especially in Africa. They have big plans. So, for example, they talk about AI. They talk about, of course, the use of technology in manufacturing. They talk about precision medicine and genomics and so many great topics. Today we've heard about art and digital art, but there is this actually barrier in connecting with the African and Middle Eastern landscape. Why? I believe because of the policy, actually, culture in the region. We've got a different culture that is here in the region. We've got a different set of rules that needs, as actually the previous session was hinting, that needs to be respected and needs to be understood. And investors in this region do not always make the effort like they're doing, by the way, in different parts of the world, including Asia, including Latin America, including even the US, in investing in understanding the local policy culture, positively engaging with governments to positively shape the rule of the game and create an enabling environment actually for the new concepts to be adopted and actually to be successful. And this is the assumption that was behind me leaving actually at the time one of the leading global actually payment companies and starting MNP. And I start getting actually so many requests from actually global companies such as Google, Microsoft, actually big pharmaceutical companies, all very much interested in this untapped potential of Africa, but they do not really know where to start and how to do it, and who are the right people to connect with when it comes in different markets. There's always this fear of the unknown when you're going to actually different African markets. Of course, there are the big, more mature markets like Egypt, Morocco, Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa, but how about Zimbabwe? How about Mali? How about Uganda? How about actually some of the emerging players like Rwanda, Ethiopia? Africa presents enormous untapped actually potential for different firms, for technology firms and for fintech, for example. Those are your next 1 billion users. For manufacturers, you're going to be actually beside, of course, sources of raw materials and mining, which will allow you to save costs and actually, and of course, being able to be more competitive. But the secret is investing in your relationships with the local ecosystem, be a long-term, of course, player, making sure that you are engaged positively and positively, of course, shape the rules of the game. And I was very delighted on basically to conclude this first intervention to actually to see that the UAE, actually the Ministry of Economy and Trade just launched their actually UAE Africa Gateway, which I believe is a very smart move from the UAE to start working on this, because the next actually generation of investors that will be coming to the UAE and investing in the UAE from China and from Europe will be here because they will be interested to operate from the UAE as a hub to the wider Africa and Middle Eastern region.
Thank you very much. So the key to unlocking growth is one, investing and building strong local relationships, to being there for the long term, and I forget the third one, but we'll get there. So Thomas, I want to ask you, as an operator for a fintech company that has grown dramatically over the last few years, on the demand side, on the market side, you're seeing the market explode. And often, Leo, we talk about these billions of young Africans that are going to be the market of the future. How are you seeing that play out in fintech and in payments in the world that you operate in?
Well, I think it's interesting because I've got a perspective where I lived 20 years in Europe. I've been now 20 years in Africa. I've got investors like Tencent in Asia, and then US investor like Greycroft. So I do travel around the world extensively, but more importantly, it gives me a perspective of everything that's happening around. I think what's been exciting is to see the transformation of Africa over the past 10 years, in the sense that, let's talk about the industries I'm coming from, which is obviously fintech and payment. I look at the lack of Visa, MasterCard, I look at the banking infrastructure in some of the first world countries. You're looking at something that's existed for the past 50, 70 years. Now, when we look at the South African market or the African market, what's very interesting is we're seeing the start from a blank sheet. Let's talk about card penetration in Africa or South Africa, for example. 1 in 8 South Africans have access to a credit card, Visa or MasterCard. Now, when you look at the opportunity from, marketplace and everything, can you hear me better? Apologies. All right. So when you look at pretty much the African continent, everything starts from a blank sheet. So what we're seeing now is us leapfrogging what we've seen happening over the past 50, 70 years in first world market. We're also talking about an economy that is 90% cash-based. 30% of the GDP of South Africa, for example, is in township and rural area. And this is something that we're seeing now being, from a financial and digital perspective, evolving rapidly. We talk about marketplace. This is pretty much the infancy of what we're seeing now in Africa versus what we've seen in the rest of the world. So I think overall, you can reflect on Cape Town as an example, being now the Silicon Valley of Africa, but you'll have to go back probably about in the 90s in the US with Silicon Valley to actually get a glimpse of what's happening on the continent now.
Thanks, Thomas. I mean, so similarly, your Flutterwave has really, of course, been one of Africa's unicorns, a poster child for tech, high-growth tech companies across the continent in Nigeria. You've tapped into real demand, and you're seeing that demand grow. So maybe give us a sense of what that demand looks like. Where is it coming from? Where's it come from? Where do you see new sources of market demand in Africa coming from?
Yeah, so if I may, I got quite excited when I saw the title of this panel, Unlocking Africa's Potential. And I think if we could just take a few seconds to talk about that potential, especially as it relates to manufacturing. I think as of this year, Africa makes up less than 5% of the world's global manufacturing output. You have more than 60% of the continent's population under the age of 25, and you have an abundance of natural resources. And if those three things don't add up to potential, I'm not quite sure what does. And so the question that we have to ask ourselves is, why, in the midst of all these different factors, does Africa today sit behind the rest of the world when it comes to tapping into that potential? And we've talked about, some of the things that maybe don't work today or maybe are in place and need to be explored or expanded a little bit further. But I think if we had to categorize those things, they would fall into maybe 4 or 5 buckets, right? One is, as Lamine said earlier, governments really taking ownership of building physical and environmental infrastructure. 2 is making sure that we have technology infrastructure in place, which is where a company like Flutterwave comes into play. really crucial is also making sure that we have educational or vocational infrastructure in play, making sure that we have the right financial and investment ecosystem, and then finally, making sure that we engage as a continent in sustainable practices. As we have leapfrogged in my industry in payments, right, where we pretty much went past or blew past the whole notion that people need to have a card to be able to transact digitally, and we went straight into mobile payments, we can do the same when it comes to manufacturing, right? Whether it's having emphasis on recycling or making sure that we create local production value chains so that we can kind of move away from a lot of the export natural resources and repurchase the end product. I think those are all different areas that we can look into as a continent from a government, but also from a private market participant perspective. And so to answer your question of how does Flutterwave think about unlocking the next phase of growth, it really is continuing to leverage technology to innovate in the digital payment space, especially when it comes to intra-Africa trade, which is also extremely crucial to the growth of manufacturing and truly tapping into Africa's potential.
Thank you so much. I mean, I love that sense of this, you know, we've got incredibly abundant natural resources, both, I think, over 60% of unused arable land, and most of the the minerals that actually go into batteries and other new green technologies actually are found in the continent. And majority of them come from the continent. But beneficiation is important. I want to just stop there for a second and say, well, if we can then have the natural resources, we can actually generate abundant energy through green technology in Africa. How do we then combine these two things to create beneficiation here in the continent to export into the rest of the world? Green steel, fertilizers, all of these important goods for the rest of the world, whether that's elements that go into battery technology, how do we get batteries manufactured in the continent? How do we create the right, either the incentives for that to happen? Does government need to be the first anchor tenant? Are there other ways to create demand for that to happen on the continent? Lamin.
Thanks. In fact, that's a very pertinent question. I mentioned to you earlier on that I was doing some work with a really innovative university in Morocco. So first of all, the richest company in Morocco is called OCP. So Morocco actually has 70% of the largest phosphates in the world. Phosphates are one of the essential aspects of fertilizers. We need fertilizers basically to feed ourselves. So one of the things that the King of Morocco, His Excellency, has done is that he's actually challenged the country to start producing green ammonia, which is necessary for fertilizers, by 2027. So behind that, an amount of about roughly $3 billion has been allocated to create a company called Innovix, which also works at this university, Mohammed VI University. And the idea is, at the moment, it seems strange that OCP basically has all this raw material, but they're a net importer of fertilizers. So the idea is by the next 5 years, they want to become a net exporter of fertilizers. But the good thing is they want to make that to be green ammonia, so to be green fertilizers. So that's one thing that they're also working on. I also wanted to touch on the aspect of also education. We had an interesting panel earlier on about education. I think Africa should definitely move away from this traditional model of education. What I mean by that is looking at the aspect of the technology space. Again, going back to that university as an example, so this university has a coding school which has 24 courses. No student has ever gone past the 12th course. And the reason is because by the time they get to the 12th course, they get hired by the top companies across the world. And of course, now they don't have to be worried about getting visas. You can have a young Moroccan teenager or 19-year-old sitting in Morocco earning $5,000 a month, more than his parents together. So I think one of the things Africa needs to look at is like, invest in this new innovative ways, because now it's so easy to democratize the space of learning from a technology perspective. I think also looking at green energy, I mentioned to you earlier on, I think that Africa really has to say, okay, these are our raw materials. What can we do? How can we invite other countries to come on board? One of my friends, I hope he's in the audience today, he's at the forefront of trying to bridge that investment from coming from China specifically into Africa, and he's already doing that. Again, using Morocco as an example, did you know that every airplane part in the world has a part made in Morocco? So that's also something that's very, very innovative. So one of the things I definitely invite people here is to look at Africa as one of the hubs. I think the US started looking at Kenya to start building a semiconductor industry in Kenya. But I think obviously other countries like Nigeria will also be a real good space. But again, the government has to take the lead to create the incentives to make sure that investors can also repatriate their money, but also looking at how to protect and look after the people as well.
A question, perhaps for Thomas first and then O, is Africa is many countries, and one of our challenges, we have very fragmented markets. The market normally looks big, but actually accessing that market is tougher. How are you both trying to overcome this fragmented market problem that we have in Africa? Thomas?
Look, I think, first of all, technology is what's bringing all 50-plus countries that we have in Africa together. I look at some of the stats in South Africa particularly. Average South African has, on average, 2 cell phones. So as much as there was a lot of fragmentation in terms of people from, cities, rural area, township, access to internet is no longer a problem. Majority of the population have access to it. So we've seen tremendous evolution, but I don't know from a Nigerian perspective and your perspective how you see it.
Yeah, so I've spent the better part of the last 7 years trying to unify African payments infrastructure, and it is not easy. I will say technology is the easiest part of it, right? We're talking about a continent that has over 50 countries, 41 currencies in circulation, over 300 types of digital payments, of which cash is still king. And the work that really has to be done, well, I think maybe a decade ago, or maybe even 5 years ago, the work that had to be done was investing in technology. I think that over the last almost decade, with companies like OZA, with companies like Flutterwave and other tech players, we've proven that it is possible to build the technology. What is next is making sure that we have frameworks, infrastructure, particularly on the regulatory side, that make it easy to scale that technology from one region to another. I think that in recent years, things have gotten easier in some ways, but also more complex in some ways.
Thank you. I'm going to leave the last comment over to you, Mustafa, before we open it up to the floor. So the last piece now that I remember you said as a strategy, you said that it is important for companies to build local relationships, invest for the long term, and help shape the market. Talk to us a little bit about how companies should think about helping to shape the market.
That's a great question. So again, we need to understand more about Africa beyond the narrative in the media. As was mentioned in the previous session, most of what we know about Africa is coming from mainstream media. We do not have enough information basically about what's really happening on the ground. By the way, I'm not talking about small or small companies or investors. Even, you'd be surprised, even my clients, and I'm talking about some of the biggest basically and leading companies in the world, when we start with actually talking to them about their strategy sessions regarding Africa and regarding different markets, we realize that they don't know anything. Basically, in terms of facts, in terms of even demographics, in terms of regulations. So again, making sure that information and data about Africa is out there and in a more accurate and realistic way is a super important step. Afterward, again, making sure that we are convening in Africa and discussing policy, basically issues. So I'm very excited that actually my team is working now with the African Union and the NEPAD to actually organize the first conference and exhibition on AI, basically application for healthcare in Africa. So that's going to be the first actually conference where different decision makers and policy makers will convene, not only government, but also private sector coming from different places, basically from the US, from, of course, from Asia, from Europe, and they're going to discuss openly AI regulatory frameworks and how basically they could be adopted basically to support healthcare systems on the continent. Having more of such constructive, transparent, and open policy conversations between companies and between governments, I think will help in creating the right enabling environments for, of course, companies to know more and investors to know more about their potential in Africa, but also governments understanding what it needs, what it really needs, basically for them to be able to materialize those opportunities and getting more investments from basically global institutions and companies.
Thank you very much to all of you. Is there any questions from the floor? There's one here and the second one over there.
Yeah, I'm afraid we can only take one, but this is the last panel, so of course you will get access to the panel straight afterwards.
That will not-
Thank you. Good afternoon, good evening. I just want to make a reflection. Listening to all of you is like we Africans are talking to ourselves. And actually, the problem is not within us. And when you say unlocking potential, I think somehow we haven't changed the narrative. And the narrative is in the world, and that is not in the global south. So I've been thinking about this, and I'm South African born. I lived in Nigeria. I've worked across most South African markets. I've run industries across Africa, invested in factories, in manufacturing, etc. But I always have to go and convince my shareholders and convince the powers that be that it's the right thing to do, because there's business to be had. There are consumers who want product. There are consumers who have aspirations, who have needs. So the problem is, it's like we're all talking to ourselves. And somehow, how do we, unlocking potential is actually speaking to the narrative of, it's about investment. We are the smartest people in the world, the most resources in the world, the vibrancy, everything is there, including government's willingness to change. And I think somehow we always think it's some alien thing, but somehow governments are willing to change if the right presentation is done, if the right case for change is done. And I think this is somehow maybe our question that we should all walk away, and I hope that another section will be, what do we do to change the narrative from the outside? Because what we need is...
So let's answer that, because I think you've asked a really good question. I'm afraid I'm going to have to cut it short after there, but they will be available, don't worry. Over to you.
Yeah. So thank you very much. And I like the sense that we have to be a lot more confident as Africans to say that by 2050 we won't be coming to Europe in boats, they'll be coming to us. So thank you very much.
Yeah, so I'd like to add to that. I think Africa is a very young continent when you look at the rest of the other market or continent. But more importantly, it's like, what about the vision that people have toward that continent? If I look at China, there's a very long-term investment that they have toward the continent and what they're bringing in terms of investment. So you can't fast-track the growth of a continent that's in its infancy. However, people that have that foresight about what it's going to become and want to invest today will be able to reap the benefit of it in the future. But more importantly, I think if you invest in Africa, more importantly, you need to be driven by impact, because it's a long-term ROI that you're looking at, and more importantly, that's something that you do from the heart.
I think for me, I very much resonate with a lot of the things that you said. We started this panel with the example of how Dubai was transformed. There was a vision. That vision was clearly articulated. People understood the vision, and people stood behind the vision. As a proud African, I think I struggle, and it might just be my lack of knowledge or ignorance, but I struggle to point out 5 countries where I can cite them as examples of where the clear vision has been set, and we all understand that vision, and we're all working towards that vision. And I think that is the work that needs to be done. Because if you look at the private sector, the most successful companies have been founded by people who have very clear vision, and they get everyone behind that vision. We can't think of countries that much differently than we think of private companies.
So very quickly, basically, the point that you've mentioned, sir, regarding governments being very responsive, this is extremely true. And as actually someone who engages with governments across Africa, I've seen them responding very positively when approached in decent and basically transparent and open basically means by different global companies and investors. And you'll be surprised, some of the conversations that we facilitated for global tech companies such as Google, Amazon, in FinTech for MasterCard and Visa, some tremendous opportunities were actually unlocked with the smallest meaningful conversations when actually some very small but meaningful conversations happened between actually the companies and the government. So yes, African governments are responsive. Yes, they're willing to reform. Yes, they're willing to take the extra mile for investors, but they need to be approached in a decent, transparent, and basically positive manner by actually of course the global and global players.
I mean,
I think just what building on what Omo Salawe mentioned was, I think, for example, if you had a child and the child says, "Dad, I can't get a job, what shall I do? Should I keep on applying for jobs?" Or would you encourage that child to say, "You know what, go out there, own your destiny, and become an entrepreneur"? I think that's what Africa should do, to be honest with you. When I worked in the UN, I used to go and help African countries, and I used to meet people who knew a lot more than me. They would say, "Lamine, how can you help us?" I say, "I can't help you. You have everything. You're more educated than I am. You know your problems better than I do. All I can do is give you a little bit of an incentive to do something." I think for this narrative to change, Africa should just say, "This is Africa, this is where we want to go. Do you want to join us? If you want to join us, come onto the boat. If you don't want to come to the boat, then go somewhere else." It sounds like a harsh message, but after 20, 25 years of being Africans, I think we just have to chart our own destiny and just go ahead. Thank you.
thank you, and a big round of applause there for the panel, and Jocelyn for that excellent moderating. Thank you so much.